I moved to a small town nestled in the heart of dense forests. There are probably thousands of towns like this in the States, but this one immediately felt different. Maybe it was the forests, breathing something otherworldly, filling the air with a tension that was barely perceptible yet persistent. I felt it the moment I stepped onto the main street. But I won't bore you with how I ended up here. Instead, let me tell you about the town itself. The people here lived simply. Some worked the land, growing vegetables and fruits. Others earned their living in the forest, hunting, gathering wild plants, or working in lumber. Then there were those who made a living off tourists, folks who came for hunting, fishing, and listening to old stories. It was this last bit that drew me here. I had a hobby, collecting local folklore. Collecting might be overstating it. I was more of a story hunter, prying tales of the past, oddities and legends out of the locals. As soon as I settled in, I began my hunt. At the bar, where the air smelled of cheap tobacco and spilled beer, I bought drinks for anyone willing to talk. But most of the stories were dull, mundane, nothing that sent shivers down my spine. One evening I shared my disappointment with one of the regulars. He smirked and said, "You need to find Frank, old hunter. Knows every tale around these parts. And not just any tales, stories that'll chill you to the bone, but only he can tell them. Nobody else even tries." That piqued my curiosity. Frank, huh? His name became my new goal. I found out that Frank spent most of his time in the forest and rarely came to town. The old man seemed to have vanished into his own mysteries, and I had to practically track him down, asking everyone I met. But Frank was nowhere to be found. Just as I was about to give up, luck found me. It happened on a Friday evening. I went to the bar for a beer, and that's when I spotted a stranger. He sat in a far corner nursing a mug of amber liquid. It was clear right away, this was no ordinary local. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older. His face, etched with wrinkles, resembled an old map with roads leading somewhere into the past. Gray hair stuck out from under a battered hunting cap, and his stubble gave him the look of someone who'd had something stronger than coffee for breakfast. His eyes were strange, bright blue, like winter ice, and so piercing it felt like he could see right through you. He was dressed simply, but everything about him screamed a life well lived. A worn plaid shirt, so washed out it looked softer than an old blanket, a dark green jacket, stained and carrying the scents of the forest, heavy boots with visibly worn soles. He smelled of campfire smoke, damp leaves, and a faint hint of gun oil. I approached him, trying to look confident but not too eager. I introduced myself, explained that I was new in town and had been looking for him. I asked if I could join him. He gave me a long, heavy look, a mix of weariness, suspicion, and maybe a touch of curiosity. Finally, he muttered, "If you want to sit, sit." Not wasting a second, I dropped into the chair across from him. To break the ice, I offered, "How about another beer, my treat?" The old man gave me a long, measured stare. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of irritation. So I got straight to the point. I told him how I'd been advised to talk to him because he knew all the local legends, stories that could make your skin crawl. He listened silently, nodding slightly, then smirked and said, "Yeah, I know a thing or two," his voice cautious. But telling it to some stranger, I began coaxing him, ordering more beer to soften his mood. Gradually, he started to relax. Beneath the gruff exterior, I found a man with a rich inner life, who only needed a little prodding to open up. He began by telling me a bit about the town. According to him, it seemed peaceful, but sometimes strange things happened here. Strange things, I echoed, intrigued. The old man nodded and leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Yeah, things that even old-timers don't like to talk about. I practically begged him to share at least one story. He took a sip of beer, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, chuckled, and finally agreed. All right, fine. Since you bought the beer, let's pass the time. He settled into his seat, his expression turning distant, as if he were reaching back into his memories. I'll start with an old story. This happened, maybe 50 years ago, maybe 40. I can't remember exactly. Back then, things weren't as strict as they are now. Folks made a living however they could, and many turned to poaching. They hunted bears, deer, anything that moved. He paused, glancing to the side as if checking to see if anyone was eavesdropping. There were these two guys back then, shady types, Bob and Jim, brothers, big guys, beards down to their chests, always in plaid shirts and overalls. They looked more like bears themselves. Everyone was scared of them, not because they did anything outright terrible, but because they were just different. They had this animalistic thing about them. He smiled faintly, but his expression quickly turned serious. These two worked their trade in secret, though I knew about it. They sold animals, bears, wolves, even lynxes, to private zoos and traveling circuses. There was this ranger, a crooked bastard who fed them tips, told them where to find the animals. The old man lowered his voice even more, as if the bar wasn't already empty enough for privacy. One day, the ranger tipped them off about a mother bear with two cubs. He'd spotted them nearby. Prime catch, you know? They didn't waste time. At dawn the next day, they headed into the forest. Frank paused for a moment, as if weighing whether to continue, then took another sip of his beer and began. His voice lowered, and he spoke as if recalling every detail, seeing it unfold before him. Bob and Jim rose early the next morning, just as the first rays of sunlight broke through. They knew the bear and her cubs wouldn't be far. All they needed was to find her tracks. Their gear was simple but specific. Hunting knives, rifles, nets, and rings. You know what those rings are for? He asked, fixing me with a piercing stare. They'd thread them through the cubs' noses. The pain made the poor creatures follow like obedient slaves. Ugly, cruel things. Frank spat on the floor as though the mere mention of those rings disgusted him. Anyway, he continued, they entered the forest, where the shadows of the pines made morning feel like late evening. The brothers moved carefully, scanning every broken twig, every indentation in the ground. They spotted tracks, huge paw prints from the bear and smaller ones from the cubs. The warm earth told them the animals were close. The brothers moved deeper, and soon they heard it, crunching sounds ahead. The mother bear stood by an old tree, her breath heavy, while the cubs rummaged nearby. Bob signaled to Jim. They moved slowly, deliberately, like shadows. Both had their rifles ready. Then the gunfire erupted, one shot after another, like thunder in an empty sky. The bear collapsed with a piercing, gut-wrenching roar that echoed through the forest. But the cubs didn't run to her as the brothers had expected. They bolted into the dense underbrush instead. Frank paused, his brow furrowed, as though replaying the scene in his mind. They gave chase. Jim went ahead, Bob close behind. They carried their nets, rings, and weapons, certain they'd catch the little ones. But instead, he raised a finger. They found him. Who? I whispered. The big old male. This bear wasn't just large, he was wrong. His fur was patchy, graying, and his eyes like fire. A gaze that sent a chill down your spine. He was gaunt, but still carried an air of terrifying strength. You could feel it, like standing in the presence of something ancient, primal beyond you. Frank clenched his fist, then slowly opened it. The bear charged at Jim, and it all happened in seconds. One swipe of his paw, Jim's rifle flew into the bushes. Another swipe, Jim hit the ground, his side torn open. I've seen bears kill before, but this wasn't killing. It was retribution. He let the weight of his words sink in before continuing. Bob realized things were bad. He dropped the nets, the rings, everything. He just ran. But the bear, this ancient beast, wasn't going to let him go. It chased him, tearing through trees as if they were reeds. Bob ran through the forest, stumbling over roots and crashing through bushes. The bear was right behind him. He could hear the roars and the heavy breathing. Whenever Bob managed to put some distance between them, he'd turn and fire. Every shot found its mark, but the beast didn't seem to notice the wounds. It kept coming, relentless like a nightmare given form. Bob's strength was failing. The forest, once an endless expanse, had become a trap with no way out. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs barely obeying. Then he saw it. A lone metal tower rose among the trees, its rusted rungs gleaming faintly in the sunlight. It looked like salvation. "You've seen those towers around, haven't you?" Frank said, taking a sip of his beer. "They used to be for spotting forest fires. Now they just stand there, relics of the past." Bob knew it was his only chance. He sprinted to the tower, scrambled up the creaking ladder, gripping the cold metal. Below, the bear roared, its glowing eyes fixed on him. When Bob reached the top, he looked down. The bear was there. The beast sat at the base of the tower like some ancient sentinel. Its battered body rose and fell with labored breaths, but it didn't seem to care about the pain. It was just waiting. And the bear waited for a long time. "Picture this," Frank said, leaning closer. "You're up there, nothing with you. Your bullets, you dropped them in the panic. You're cold, hungry, and below you, death is sitting there patient as the grave." Days passed. Cold September nights gave way to grim dawns. Bob tried yelling for help, but in those wild parts, no one could hear him. He knew no rescue was coming. On the third day, Bob couldn't hold out any longer. The cold and thirst took him. He froze to death, curled up on the platform, a final flicker of human desperation. "And the bear?" I asked. Frank took a long sip from his mug. "The bear died too. The beast was old, wounded, but it didn't leave. It just waited. That's the strangest part, you see. The forest is full of food, water, places to heal, but it stayed. When rangers finally found them, the sight was haunting. Bob's body lay atop the tower, frozen stiff, almost like an ice statue. And below, at the base, they found the bear. The massive creature, covered in scars and dried blood, lay dead. But the strangest thing, Frank lowered his voice, was that the rangers found a metal ring in its nose. I stared at him, shocked. "A ring? Like the ones Bob and Jim used?" He nodded. "Yeah, just like those. Maybe it was one of the cubs they'd tried to capture long ago. Or maybe it was the victim of some other poachers." Frank gazed into his mug, lost in thought. "You know," he said quietly, "stories like this make you believe there's something more out there than just nature. How else do you explain a creature remembering? Hunting them down like enemies?" I nodded. The story was truly chilling. The poacher's fate was a grim one. I ordered another round of beer for myself and the old man. He nodded silently, accepting the gesture, and pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. Lighting one up, he let the gray smoke curl around his face, his eyes distant as if he were reliving old memories. When the cigarette had burned halfway down, he began to speak. "This time I'll tell you what happened to me. It was about 20 years ago. Winter then was real, brutal and unforgiving. The snow crunched underfoot, and the air burned your lungs. One morning, John came to see me. We often hunted together. He looked troubled and said, 'Will's gone missing.' Will was a local hunter, a tough guy. John told me Will's wife had come to him in tears. Her husband had gone hunting and never returned. 'We have to go look for him,' John said. 'You know these woods better than anyone.' I didn't hesitate. I grabbed everything I needed, my rifle, a knife, a compass, a winter coat, and sturdy boots. The forest in winter is no joke. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind howled through the treetops like a wounded animal. Going in unprepared would have been a death sentence. We set out right away. Along the way, we alerted the rangers, who organized their own search party. But I knew time wasn't on our side. If Will was lost or injured, every minute counted. We trudged through the forest following the route he was likely to have taken. It was grueling work. The snow crunched beneath our feet. Our boots sank into drifts, and the freezing air made our cheeks go numb. The oppressive silence was broken only by our footsteps and the occasional crack of branches. "Here!" John suddenly said, pointing ahead. There were tracks in the snow. At first I thought they were deer tracks, but as I looked closer I realized they were human. The tracks led deeper into the forest. "Could be Will," I said, feeling a flicker of hope. We followed the trail. The footprints meandered, winding around rocks and fallen trees, but we pressed on. Eventually, we came upon an old wooden house. The house was decrepit, frosted over, as if the forest had claimed it long ago. The windows were empty, gaping holes, and the door hung askew. A thick layer of snow blanketed the roof, and broken timber lay scattered around, evidence of neglect. "You know what's strange?" John muttered, staring at the house. "I saw something here once." "Something? Something?" I asked, glancing at him. "I don't know how to describe it. Something big, fast. I don't know what the hell it was. Ever since then, I've avoided this place." His words sent a shiver down my spine. But we didn't have a choice. "Will might have taken shelter here from the cold," I said. "We need to check it out." We approached the house, each step echoing loudly in my ears. The door swayed slightly on its hinges, creaking louder than the howling wind. I gripped my rifle tighter. Strange things often happened in these woods, but this place felt wrong. Alien, as if it didn't belong. We stepped inside the old house, easing the door open. The hinges groaned so loudly it felt like the house itself was warning us of danger. Inside, it was dark, despite the daylight outside. A thin layer of frost covered the wooden floors as though time had decided to freeze this moment forever. The peeling remnants of wallpaper clung to the walls, and a collapsed stool sat in one corner draped in cobwebs. In the center of the room lay a broken bucket and an ancient stove poked out from behind a crumbling partition. "Look!" John exclaimed, pointing to a shadowy corner. There, barely visible in the gloom, sat Will. He was pale, gaunt, and shivering, as if he hadn't noticed us until we came closer. His clothes were filthy and torn, his face hollow, and his feverish eyes glittered unnervingly. He was curled up, hugging his knees, staring past us into some unseen void. "Will, are you okay?" John was the first to rush over, grabbing him by the shoulders. I followed. But the moment I got a good look at him, I knew something was wrong. He didn't respond, didn't meet our eyes, just kept staring over our heads like we weren't even there. "Will, what happened?" I asked, shaking him gently. But he said nothing. His body trembled violently, as if on the verge of collapse. We tried to get him to speak, but his gaze remained fixed behind us. "What's he looking at?" John murmured. And then we heard it, footsteps. Deliberate, measured steps crunching through the snow outside the house. John and I immediately grabbed our rifles, spinning toward the door. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. "Who's there?" John shouted, but there was no reply. The footsteps stopped. We stood frozen, the tension in the air pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. Even the forest outside seemed to hold its breath. After a few moments, Will stirred. He blinked, his gaze clearing slightly, and he began to come back to himself. "Will, what happened? Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but urgent. He licked his cracked lips and started speaking, his voice hoarse and barely audible, as though every word cost him effort. "I went hunting. The weather was good. The snow soft. Everything was normal." We listened intently, not interrupting. "I was walking deeper into the woods when I noticed strange tracks. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. Too big for a wolf, and they looked almost human." His voice faltered and he paused, his body shaking. Then he continued. "I got curious, wanted to see where they led, followed them, and then I saw it." "Saw what?" John asked, his grip tightening on his rifle. "It came out from between the trees. It was something—" Will's voice broke and his hollow eyes locked onto ours. "It looked like a wolf or a dog, but it was too big, too wrong. Its body was like a man's but covered in thick black fur. It stood on two legs but moved like a predator. Its eyes, they were burning." He gasped, as if reliving the terror. "I couldn't move. It stared at me and I just froze. It was a kind of fear you can't put into words." "And then?" I prompted, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "My dog. She charged at it. Without warning, she growled, leapt at it, but it killed her with one move." Will's voice dropped to a whisper. "And then it looked at me, and I thought, this is it. This is how I die. But it didn't touch me. It just turned away and disappeared into the forest." "You're sure it left?" John pressed. Will nodded. "Yes, it left me. Why, I don't know, but I ran. I ran without stopping until I found this house." When Will finished his story, I felt an uneasy tension knot in my stomach. At first I thought he was just exhausted and hallucinating. But when I glanced at John, I realized he wasn't doubting a single word. There was something strange in his eyes, a mix of unease and understanding. He believed Will completely. Outside, the daylight was fading fast. Twilight crept over the forest, turning it into a shapeless sea of shadows. We suggested heading back to town, but Will shook his head violently. "No, I'm not going out there. Not at night. No way." John and I exchanged glances. He shrugged, silently agreeing that staying here might be the better option. As unsettling as the house felt, the thought of venturing into the dark woods seemed worse. We decided to spend the night there, no matter how frightening it was. We set to work securing the house as best we could. We boarded up the broken windows with planks we scavenged, reinforced the door, and checked every corner. In the back, we found a small pile of old, dry firewood, carefully stacked by someone long ago. John lit the stove, and soon the cold began to retreat. I unpacked my supplies: some bread, dried meat, and water. We split everything between the three of us. Will devoured his share silently but ravenously, like someone who hadn't eaten in days. We sat around the stove, letting the warmth ease the chill from our bodies. For a while, the fear seemed to ebb away. The firelight danced across the walls, and the comforting crackle of the flames filled the room. but the oppressive sense of something unnatural lingered, just at the edge of awareness. Then it happened. At first we heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps crunching through the snow outside the house. John and I immediately stiffened, gripping our rifles. Will froze, his face going pale, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "It's here," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the wall as if he could see through it. The footsteps moved around the house, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, as if whatever it was circling us, studying us. My heart pounded, and I tightened my grip on the cold steel of the rifle. And then we saw it. In one of the boarded windows, a silhouette appeared. Tall, dark, unnaturally elongated. It stood perfectly still, its head nearly brushing the top of the window frame. Its eyes, two glowing yellow orbs, pierced through the darkness, locking onto us. The creature moved, its clawed hand reaching slowly for the window frame, as though testing it. "Who's there?" John said, leaping to his feet. There was no response. The thing just stared at us, unmoving. John raised his rifle and fired. The deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the tense silence, and shards of glass rained down as the window blew apart. But the silhouette was gone. The silence returned, heavier than before. We stood frozen, straining to hear anything over the sound of our own breathing. "Is it gone?" I whispered. "Not sure," John muttered, reloading his rifle with trembling hands. I glanced at him. His face was drawn tight, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. "We can't stay here," I said. "We need to leave before things get worse." "You think it's safer out there?" John shot back with a humorless laugh. He sat back down by the fire and spoke softly, almost to himself. "When I was a kid, my old man used to tell stories about the Dogmen. A mythical creature, they said, that roamed these woods. Half wolf, half dog, but with the body of a man. Huge, terrifying, always hungry." I listened intently, searching his tone for any hint of a joke, but there was none. "They say it only shows up when someone does something wrong. Maybe they wander where they shouldn't, hunt what they're not supposed to, or just come into the forest with bad intentions. It watches, waits, and then—" He stopped, running a hand over his face. "You're saying that was the dog man?" I asked, a cold chill crawling up my spine. John nodded. "Maybe, but one thing's for sure, whatever we saw wasn't supposed to exist." We sat there, the fire casting flickering shadows around the room, each of us lost in our thoughts. One thing was clear. This night was far from over. The night was anything but peaceful. Every minute felt like we were being watched. The footsteps returned, heavy and deliberate, circling the house with a predatory patience. Whatever it was seemed to test every crack, every window, as if searching for a way in. At times the steps grew closer, and we froze, clutching our rifles, silently praying that the thin walls would hold. "It's not going to leave," Will whispered, huddled near the stove. His eyes shone with the flickering firelight, his face pale as death. I glanced at John. He was silent, but his expression said it all. We both knew this wasn't just some animal. No ordinary creature would behave like this or instill such bone-deep dread. None of us got any real sleep that night. We took turns standing watch, listening to every sound. The forest outside was deathly still, as if all life had fled, leaving us alone with whatever this was. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the frost-covered windows, we exhaled in relief. Daylight brought a fragile sense of safety. "We're leaving," John said, his voice resolute as he looked at me. We stepped out of the house cautiously, rifles at the ready. The icy air stung my face, but the sensation was almost welcome. A reminder that we were still alive. The snow around the house was littered with tracks. They circled the house over and over, as though something had prowled all night watching us. The prints were enormous, resembling those of a wolf, but far too large and disturbingly human-like. We stared at them in silence, each of us privately acknowledging what we didn't want to believe. "So it really was," I began. But John raised a hand to cut me off. "Just keep moving." We trudged through the forest slowly, every step measured, as if afraid to disturb the eerie stillness that seemed to hang over everything. I could feel it, the weight of an unseen presence following us. That heavy, oppressive sensation of being watched clung to my back like a shadow. "It's still here," Will whispered, his gaze darting nervously to the trees. None of us dared to speak the thought that was on all our minds. This wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Something that had no place in this world. When we finally emerged from the forest, the weight lifted, as if an invisible chain had been cut. But deep inside, I felt a lingering unease. The fear was too vivid, too real to be forgotten. Frank paused his story, took a long drink from his beer, and then looked at me. "So, what do you think? True or not?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. It all sounded like a tall tale, yet the way he told it, every word was so vivid, so soaked in detail, it felt impossible to dismiss outright. "I don't know," I admitted honestly, feeling the strange tug-of-war between doubt and a gnawing fear I couldn't shake. Frank smirked, lighting another cigarette. He squinted toward the window of the bar as if peering into the distant past. "Neither do I," he said. "But sometimes, kid, things happen out there in the woods that you're better off not trying to explain." I sat there in silence, my thoughts swirling. Maybe it was just a story. But then again, what if it wasn't? Frank took a deep drag, exhaled a cloud of smoke, and continued. "I had a friend, Lewis. Good guy, known him since we were kids. But not too long ago, I buried him. Maybe I'll join him soon. Who knows?" He paused, staring into the distance for a moment, then added, "Lewis worked as a park ranger his whole life. But the place he worked at wasn't your average park. It was a restricted zone. No tourists, no hunters, no one allowed in. Strange place, mysterious. For some reason they guarded it tighter than the White House." He took another drag, as if deciding whether to go on. "So about 40 years ago, Lewis got a job there. It was a good gig, paid better than other parks, but getting in was nearly impossible. Huge competition, and they vetted you like you were applying for the CIA. But somehow, Lewis made it through. He started the job, and at first, everything was routine. Patrols, perimeter checks, the usual stuff. But then, one day, everything changed. It happened when the bodies of some tourists were found, mauled in a nearby forest. A horrific story. But what made it even stranger was that Lewis's boss, Donovan, took him to the scene. Lewis said it wasn't just odd, it was downright suspicious, Frank said. They were rangers, not cops. But Donovan insisted, so off they went. When they arrived, the local police and sheriff let them onto the scene without any questions, which only deepened the mystery. Lewis later told me he felt out of place, like he'd been dropped into someone else's game where everyone knew the rules but him. Frank paused for a moment, took a sip of beer, and went on. The campsite was trashed, tents shredded, everything scattered, like a tornado had hit. But the worst part was the bodies. Lewis said he'd never seen anything like it in his life. One body lay on the ground torn to pieces, barely recognizable. Another was found in the bushes as if something had thrown it there. Frank looked at me, his eyes turning serious. And the third was hanging from a tree. A chill ran down my spine. Hanging? I repeated. Frank nodded. Yeah, picture this. A massive tree, its branches like skeleton fingers reaching for the sky. And up there, dangling from one of them, was a body. Lewis said he nearly puked. He was 30 at the time, just a young guy starting out. He wasn't ready for something like that. Frank paused again, as if replaying Lewis's story in his mind. There was this unnatural silence, you know the kind. No birds singing, no rustling leaves. The forest felt frozen. Lewis said the air was thick, like something heavy was pressing down on the place. And what happened next? I asked, feeling a growing sense of unease. Lewis and Donovan started looking around the camp. The sheriff and his guys just stood off to the side, quiet, like they were waiting for something. And that's when Lewis realized they knew more than they were letting on. Frank took another deep drag and continued. Lewis said that when they began examining the campsite, Donovan acted like he knew exactly what to look for. He moved deliberately, scanning the ground, broken branches, and shredded tents. Eventually, Donovan found something. A strange, torn piece of fabric, stained with blood and what looked like a patch of fur. He carefully placed it all into a small plastic bag he'd brought along. At the time, Lewis didn't know what to think. He'd never seen a park ranger work like a forensic investigator before. Once they were done, Donovan approached the police, exchanged a few brief words with the sheriff, shook his hand, and they headed back toward the restricted zone. On the way, Lewis finally worked up the nerve to ask, "Donovan, what was that? What did you find?" Donovan stopped, turned, and gave him a look Lewis had never seen before, a mix of sternness and gravity. "Remember that non-disclosure agreement you signed?" Donovan asked. Lewis nodded. "Yeah, of course. I thought it was just a formality." "It wasn't," Donovan replied, continuing to walk. "You're about to find out why." "What was it then?" Lewis pressed. Donovan stopped again, but this time he looked Lewis square in the eye. Judging by the evidence, it was an attack by a pack of werewolves. Lewis burst out laughing, assuming it was a joke. "Werewolves? You're serious? Aren't those just fairy tales?" Donovan frowned. "They're real, and you're about to find out just how real." Frank leaned back in his chair as if reliving his friend's words. Donovan explained to Lewis that you don't just go out and fight these creatures. They're too strong, too dangerous, but you can negotiate with them. If the conflict is their fault, they handle it themselves. There's a pact between them and humans. Frank paused to take another drag, then went on. Donovan led Lewis to a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. He told him that rituals were important. No weapons, no aggressive moves. Anything like that could upset the balance. In the clearing, Donovan started gathering herbs. Wild plants with thin green stems and sharp blade-like leaves. Then he picked up some dry twigs and small branches. Lewis said Donovan worked with a calm, almost ritualistic precision. It was like he knew every plant, every twig. When everything was ready, Donovan arranged the herbs and sticks in a small circle, as if following some ancient set of rules. Then he pulled out a box of matches and lit the pile. The fire sparked to life, slowly consuming the dry branches and herbs. Thick smoke rose from the flames, unusually white and faintly sweet-smelling. It curled upward, straight toward the treetops, dissolving into the cold winter air. Lewis said he stood there, mesmerized, Frank continued. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt it was something far beyond just lighting a fire. Frank continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if he didn't want anyone else in the bar to overhear this part of the story. After the smoke rose into the sky, they waited. Lewis said he had no idea what to expect and grew more anxious with each passing second. Then, in the distance, he spotted a thin column of smoke rising from the forest. "That's it," Donovan said, pointing to the wisp of smoke. "It's time to go." They set off. Night was beginning to settle over the woods, and it grew darker with each step. In the beam of their flashlights, the trees cast long, menacing shadows that shifted like living things. The sounds of the forest faded away. No rustling leaves, no calls of night birds. Everything around them seemed frozen, leaving only the crunch of their boots in the snow. "Lewis told me the forest felt dead," Frank said, "but not empty." Amid the eerie silence, they began to hear noises, low, guttural sounds, as though they were coming from the very heart of the forest. "Donovan, what is that?" Lewis asked, gripping his flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Ignore it," Donovan said curtly, his voice cold and steady, like steel. The shadows around them grew thicker. At one point, out of the corner of his eye, Lewis caught movement. Something large darting between the trees, accompanied by a muted growl. He froze. His breath caught in his throat, but Donovan placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't react," Donovan said quietly. "If you show fear, they'll sense it." Lewis told me it was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand still. But he listened to Donovan as if his life depended on it, because it did. As they pressed on, the noises began to fade. They emerged into a clearing surrounded by towering trees. Donovan stopped and signaled for Lewis to do the same. "We wait," Donovan said simply. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, which gave everything a ghostly glow. The air was heavy, almost tangible, charged with something Lewis couldn't quite explain. Suddenly, there was a sound. The crack of breaking branches, muffled but unmistakable. They turned toward the noise and froze. From the dark tree line, 3 figures emerged. Lewis said he'd never seen anything like them, Frank said, lowering his voice even further. They were creatures, part wolf, part human. Their bodies were covered in thick, dark fur, but their shapes were unmistakably humanoid. Massive paws, tipped with claws that glinted in the moonlight, extended from muscular arms. They walked upright, their movements fluid and predatory, like animals accustomed to the hunt. Lewis described one of them in particular, a maw like a wolf's, but its eyes were human, deep, ancient, filled with something unknowable. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching Donovan and Lewis intently. The air around them grew even heavier, and Lewis felt his breathing quicken. "Don't move," Donovan whispered. The figures stood silently, but their presence was overwhelming. Lewis told me that in that moment he realized they weren't just animals, they were something far beyond his understanding, something he could never hope to explain. The 3 creatures began circling Donovan and Lewis, their movements deliberate and predatory, like apex hunters sizing up their prey. Their eyes glinted in the darkness, and low, guttural growls rippled through the air like waves, filling the space with an oppressive tension. Lewis stood frozen, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. Donovan, in stark contrast, remained calm, as if this was something he'd experienced before. Slowly, he pulled out the evidence he had collected at the crime scene. Torn fabric, patches of fur, anything that might connect to the attack. Then, with even greater care, he revealed a rabbit carcass. Lewis said he hadn't even noticed when Donovan packed it, Frank added with a faint smirk. The largest of the creatures, clearly the leader, stepped forward. Its massive frame loomed over the clearing, muscles rippling beneath its dark fur. Its head was wolf-like, but the eyes, cold and human, fixed on Donovan with an unnerving intensity. It bent down to inspect the evidence, sniffing it with deep, rasping breaths. Lewis told me he nearly fainted, Frank continued. But Donovan? He stood there like a rock. The leader raised its head and let out a thunderous growl. The sound was sharp and piercing, almost like a command. Instantly, the other two creatures halted, their attention snapping to the leader. Moments later, all three disappeared into the forest, melting into the shadows as if they had never been there. Lewis collapsed to his knees, trembling, while Donovan remained composed. "We've done what we can," Donovan said calmly. "Now, we wait." They exited the forest and set up camp near the boundary of the restricted zone. Donovan busied himself with his gear outside the tent while Lewis sat inside, trying to steady his nerves. 2 days passed in uneasy silence. On the third night, just as Lewis began resigning himself to the uncertainty, the forest came alive. Long, mournful howls echoed through the trees, shattering the stillness of the night. The sound was haunting, both beautiful and terrifying. "Lewis told me it wasn't like any wolf howl he'd ever heard," Frank said. "It was like the voice of the forest itself, like a warning." But Donovan didn't flinch. He simply said, "It's their business now." The next morning, when they stepped out of the tent, Lewis froze. Lying directly in front of them were 3 severed forelegs. Each had been cut cleanly, as if by a blade just above the shoulder. "It's them," Donovan said. "The pack dealt with the intruders." Lewis stared at the dismembered limbs, a mixture of relief and unease washing over him. On one hand, the ordeal was over. On the other, a deep sense of dread lingered. He asked Donovan, "How long will this peace last?" Frank said. And Donovan answered, "As long as humans respect the rules." They returned to base. But the experience stayed with Lewis for a long time. Frank finished his beer and gave me a wry look. "So," he said, "what do you think? Truth or fiction?" I was tipsy by then, and honestly, the story seemed like a wild fabrication. But I replied, "Hard to believe, but damn, it's a good story. Maybe you've got another one." Frank shook his head and stood up. "Another time, kid. I gotta go." He clapped me on the shoulder, thanked me, and walked out of the bar. I sat there staring at my empty glass, turning the tale over in my mind. Damn, his stories were good. So good that I realized I needed to write it all down before I forgot a single detail. Was it true? That's not for me to decide. That's for whoever reads these words to figure out.